To understand what Patton did in France, you have to first understand what they did to Patton. In the summer of 1943, George S. Patton was arguably the most successful American battlefield commander of the war. His 7th Army had swept through Sicily with a ferocity and speed that had stunned even his British allies. He was bold, aggressive, and absolutely ruthless in his demand for forward momentum. While other commanders hesitated and consolidated and called for more supplies and more time and more certainty, Patton attacked. He always attacked. It was the only mode of warfare he had ever understood or respected. He had been studying war his entire life. As a young man, he had competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Olympics. He had ridden with General Pershing into Mexico chasing Pancho Villa. He had commanded the 1st American tank unit in the First World War, personally leading his men into combat on foot when his tank became stuck in the mud, getting shot through the leg, refusing to leave the field until he had directed his forces to their objective. He had spent the decades between the wars writing, thinking, and obsessing over the nature of armored warfare while most of the American military establishment was still debating whether the horse cavalry still had a future. George Patton was not a man who had stumbled into greatness. He had pursued it with the focused intensity of someone who believed, quite literally, that he had been born for it, that his soul had fought in the armies of Caesar, of Napoleon, of Alexander, and had returned to fight one final time in this, the greatest war in human history. But in August of 1943, in a field hospital in Sicily, George Patton destroyed himself. He walked into a medical tent and found a young soldier sitting on a cot without any visible wound. The soldier's name was Private Charles Cool, and he was 21 years old, and he was trembling. The medical report said battle fatigue. What Patton saw was cowardice. Everything in him, 60 years of warrior culture, of military tradition, of absolute contempt for weakness, rose up in a single explosive moment, and he slapped the soldier across the face. He called him a coward. He threatened to have him shot. He screamed at the doctors. And then he left, and he thought nothing more of it, because in the world George Patton inhabited, what he had done was not an aberration. It was discipline. Within weeks, the story had reached the press. Within months, it had reached the American public. And the reaction was not what Patton expected. The American public, reading about their sons and brothers and fathers trembling in hospital tents from the psychological devastation of combat, did not see cowardice. They saw their children. They were furious. Congressmen called for Patton's dismissal. Reporters demanded his court-martial. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe and Patton's commanding officer, was caught between his genuine belief that Patton was militarily irreplaceable and the overwhelming political pressure to remove him entirely. Eisenhower kept him, but at a cost. Patton was publicly humiliated, forced to apologize to the soldiers he had slapped, forced to apologize to his entire command, forced to stand before the men he led and lower himself in a way that was, for someone of his particular psychological makeup, almost physically painful. He was then effectively benched. While other commanders planned and executed the greatest military operation in history, the D-Day landings at Normandy in June of 1944, Patton was given a fake army. The first United States Army Group, known as FUSAG, existed largely on paper, a deliberate deception operation designed to convince the Germans that the main Allied invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Patton was made its commander precisely because the Germans believed he was the best American general, and therefore wherever Patton was, that must be where the real attack was coming. So as other men fought and bled on the beaches of Normandy, George Patton sat in England, attending fake briefings for a fake army, appearing at public events so German spies would see him and report back, and waiting. He was 58 years old. He had been waiting for this war his entire life. And they had turned him into a decoy. The weeks after Normandy were agony for him. The breakout from the beaches was slow and brutal. The hedgerow country of Normandy, the bocage, those ancient earthen walls overgrown with dense vegetation that divided the French countryside into thousands of small enclosed fields, was a nightmare for armored forces. American tanks were being destroyed trying to push through gaps that funneled them directly into German anti-tank fire. The fighting was grinding, costly, and dispiriting. And Patton, watching from England, was nearly out of his mind. He wrote in his diary during this period with a desperation that is almost difficult to read. He was terrified that the war would end before he got there. He was terrified that history would record the great battles of the Second World War and his name would appear only in footnotes. He had spent his whole life preparing for this moment, and the moment was happening without him, and there was nothing he could do about it except wait and appear at the right public functions and let the Germans think that where Patton stood, there the real blow would fall. But there were men in the Allied command who had not forgotten what Patton could do when given the freedom to do it. And when General Omar Bradley, commanding the American forces in Normandy, began planning Operation Cobra, the massive breakout from the bocage that would finally crack the German line and open France, it was to Patton that he turned to exploit whatever gap they could punch through. In late July of 1944, Patton was quietly brought to France. He was given command of the Third Army. And the orders he received were essentially, go. The German line had been broken at Avranches, a critical bottleneck on the western edge of Normandy where the road network funneled south and east into open France. The gap was narrow, at its tightest point, only a few miles wide, and the Germans were attempting desperately to close it. Everything that Patton was going to push through the next several weeks had to pass through that gap under German fire, including not just his combat units but his supply trains, his artillery, his engineers, his medical units, the entire logistical apparatus of a modern army of hundreds of thousands of men. A cautious commander would have secured the flanks before advancing. A cautious commander would have ensured a solid defensive perimeter before pushing further into France. A cautious commander would have waited for the supply situation to stabilize before committing to a deep armored thrust. Patton was not a cautious commander. From the very first day of the Third Army's operations, he drove his commanders with an intensity that bordered on mania. He was personally on the roads, in his jeep, moving between units, appearing at command posts, watching convoys, and screaming at anyone who was stopped for any reason other than enemy fire. The Third Army's initial movement through the Avranches Gap was so rapid and so compressed that the roads were jammed with vehicles bumper to bumper for miles. Other generals would have called a halt, would have organized the traffic, would have ensured order before proceeding. Patton looked at the jam and told his officers to keep everything moving. He accepted the chaos as the price of speed, and he judged, correctly, that the chaos of forward movement was infinitely preferable to the order of standing still. In those first hours, there were moments of genuine terror. German artillery was still falling on the roads. German aircraft were still attacking the columns. The vehicles were so tightly packed that a single bomb could destroy dozens of them. Soldiers who had trained for years to spread out, to maintain tactical intervals, to avoid exactly this kind of dense bunching of forces, found themselves driving through what felt like a shooting gallery, trusting that the speed of their movement would save them where dispersion could not. Some of them did not survive. The road through the Avranches Gap claimed lives on those first days, and the men who drove it knew they were gambling against very bad odds. But they drove. Because Patton was watching, and because somewhere in the personality of this man, this profane, ivory-handled pistol-wearing, Bible-quoting, reincarnation-believing, utterly extraordinary human being, there was something that communicated absolute certainty to the people around him. Not false confidence. Not performance. Certainty. The certainty of a man who has spent 60 years preparing for exactly this moment and knows, in every cell of his body, that he was born to be here. The men of the Third Army felt it. Sergeants who had been cautious in Normandy became reckless at Avranches, because recklessness was what Patton demanded and because, somehow, in his presence, recklessness felt like wisdom. Platoon leaders who had hesitated at every hedgerow in the bocage now made split-second decisions and acted on them without waiting for orders from above, because the Third Army's culture under Patton was explicit: do not wait for orders when you can act. Do not stop when you can move. Do not defend when you can attack. Do not consolidate when you can exploit. Always, always, always go forward. On August 1, 1944, the Third Army officially became operational. By nightfall on August 1, its lead elements were already 20 miles beyond the breakthrough point. By August 3, they had reached Rennes, the ancient capital of Brittany, covering in 48 hours a distance that conventional military planning suggested would require at least a week. By August 7, they were fighting at Le Mans, nearly 150 miles from where they had started. The speed was so extraordinary that the Germans could not process it through their normal command systems. Reports would arrive at German headquarters of American armored units at a certain location, and by the time the report had moved up the chain of command and a response had been formulated and orders had been sent back down, the American units were 40 miles further east and the response was addressing a situation that no longer existed. But speed alone does not explain what the Third Army achieved in those first 2 weeks. Speed was the instrument. What made the instrument work was something far harder to quantify, and it lived in the relationship between Patton and the men he commanded. Private James Langdon of the 4th Armored Division was 19 years old in August of 1944. He had grown up on a farm in rural Missouri, had never driven anything faster than his father's tractor before the Army put him in a tank, and had spent his first months in combat in the grinding misery of the Normandy hedgerows convinced, in the way young men in bad situations become convinced, that he was going to die in France and that nothing he did individually mattered very much in the grand scheme of things. He was a small part of a very large machine, and the machine was moving very slowly through a very bloody landscape, and he had the particular psychological numbness of a young person who has stopped imagining a future because imagining a future hurts too much. Then the Third Army moved, and Patton appeared. Langdon would later, decades later, sitting in a veterans meeting in rural Missouri, try to explain to people who had never served what it was like to be part of the Third Army's breakout. He said it was like a fever. He said it was like the whole army caught something contagious, some kind of collective insanity that made men do things they knew were dangerous and do them anyway without hesitation. He said that when word passed down the column that Patton was nearby, that the old man was somewhere on this road, in his jeep, watching, it changed the quality of the air. Men who had been slumped in their vehicles sat up straight. Drivers who had been coasting pushed their accelerators down. Tank commanders who had been buttoned up inside their vehicles opened their hatches and stood up in the turrets despite the risk, because somehow it felt wrong to be hiding when Patton was watching. He said he only saw Patton once in those 2 weeks. The general's jeep was stopped by the side of a road, and Patton was standing on the hood, watching a column of armor go past. He was in full uniform, his helmet polished, his face absolutely still, his eyes moving from vehicle to vehicle with a concentration so intense it was almost frightening. As Langdon's tank rolled past, Patton's gaze found his face specifically, in the turret of the tank, and held it for just a moment. And Langdon said that in that moment, for the only time in his life, he understood completely and without any doubt what he was doing and why it mattered and that it was possible to do it. He said it lasted maybe 3 seconds. He said he never forgot it for the rest of his life. This was Patton's most extraordinary and least understood gift. He could make individual men, in individual moments of contact, feel that their specific presence and their specific effort was personally known and personally demanded by him. Not through kindness, Patton was not kind, not in any conventional sense, but through attention. Through the absolute, burning, focused attention of a man who treated every soldier as a crucial component in a machine he was building in real time, and who communicated through his very presence that the machine was working, that it was unstoppable, and that each person inside it was necessary to its function. But there were limits to what even Patton's will could accomplish. And as the first week of August became the second, those limits began to appear. The supply situation was becoming desperate. The Third Army was moving so fast that its supply lines, the trucks carrying fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts from the beaches of Normandy to the forward units, could barely keep up. A tank that runs out of fuel is not a weapon. It is an expensive metal box sitting in a French field. The 4th Armored Division, Patton's sharpest sword, was burning fuel at a rate that terrified the logistics officers. At certain points during the first week, the forward tank units had less than a day's fuel supply on hand. If the supply trucks had been delayed by bad roads, or German air attack, or simple mechanical failure, the entire advance could have stalled at any moment. Patton knew this. His logistics officers told him, repeatedly and with increasing desperation, that the army was outrunning its supply chain. They showed him the numbers. The numbers were alarming. And Patton looked at the numbers and told them to figure it out, because he was not stopping. There is something in this that it is easy, from a distance of 80 years, to romanticize. The bold commander who ignores the cautious staff officers and drives forward on instinct and glory. But what Patton was actually doing in those moments was something more sophisticated than romantic boldness. He was making a calculated judgment that the risk of stopping, of giving the German army time to recover, to reorganize, to establish a coherent defensive line, was greater than the risk of continuing with inadequate supplies. He understood, in a way that his logistics officers could not fully see from their position in the supply chain, that the German army he was pursuing was not a coherent force waiting to be resupplied and reenergized. It was a broken thing, a shattering thing, and that it needed only one moment's pause, one moment when the pressure released and the fear eased and the officers had time to stop running and start thinking, to begin to cohere again into something that could stop him. He was not wrong. The German army's capacity for reconstitution under pressure was one of the most remarkable military phenomena of the war. Formations that were destroyed in the morning would be rebuilt by nightfall with whatever survivors and replacement units could be scraped together. Commanders who had lost their entire commands would gather stragglers and form new ad hoc battle groups and establish defensive positions in hours. If Patton stopped, even for 2 days, even for the time needed to properly restock his fuel reserves, he ran the genuine risk of finding a coherent German defense where there had been chaos. So he didn't stop. He called his supply officers and his transportation officers and his fuel depot commanders and he told them, with the kind of clarity that leaves no room for misunderstanding, that he needed fuel forward, that he needed it now, and that whatever they needed to do to make that happen was authorized. He personally called Bradley and demanded priority on available transport. He called his corps commanders and told them to collect every fuel can in every abandoned German position they came across. He authorized his units to commandeer civilian vehicles if military trucks were unavailable. He ran the supply chain the same way he ran his tank columns, at maximum speed, accepting risks that conventional logistics management would never have countenanced, betting that the velocity of his advance was itself a form of supply economy because a fast-moving army was harder to hit, harder to attrit, and was capturing German fuel and ammunition depots faster than it was consuming its own. And somehow, day after day, the fuel arrived. Not always enough, not always in time, but always enough and in time to keep moving, which was the only standard that mattered to George Patton. By August 14, 14 days after the Third Army had become operational, its lead elements had covered nearly 400 miles of French countryside. They had liberated dozens of towns, captured tens of thousands of prisoners, destroyed hundreds of German tanks and vehicles, and were now positioned in a great sweeping arc that threatened to encircle the entire German Army Group B, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, in what would become known as the Falaise Pocket. In those 14 days, the strategic situation in France had been transformed so completely that it was virtually unrecognizable. The German army that had fought so stubbornly in the bocage for weeks was now in full retreat across France, and everywhere it tried to stop and establish a defensive line, Patton's forces were already there going around it. The German command system was breaking down under the speed of events. Communications were failing. Commanders were losing contact with their units. The fundamental military problem of maintaining a coherent front, of ensuring that every unit knows what the units beside it are doing, was becoming insoluble because events were moving faster than any communications system could track. And in German headquarters across France, general officers who had spent their careers studying the limits of what was militarily possible were looking at maps and beginning to understand that whatever limits they had learned, George Patton did not respect them.